David and Bathsheba, one of the greatest tragedies of the Bible. But who was Bathsheba? And what was her relationship to David? Was she just a woman that he decided to have an affair with? Or is it more complicated than that? Let us explore this and see if we can come to a deeper understanding of this horrible situation. So first, let us consider Bathsheba. We know who David is. Let us consider Bathsheba. In 2 Samuel chapter 11, verse 3, when David inquires after her, he is told that she is the daughter of Eliam and the wife of Uriah the Hittite. Who is Eliam and who is Uriah? Well, in 2 Samuel, again, chapter 23, we have a listing of David's mighty men, his elite force. And in this, verse 34 is Eliam, the son of Ahithophel. And in verse 39 is Uriah the Hittite. Both of these men were part of the 30. David's elite force, his commanders, his captains, likely captains over thousands. These were his elite force, and these were the men who had been traveling with him from the time that he fled from Saul before he became king. Now, Eliam is said to be the son of Ahithophel. Who was Ahithophel? Well, in 1 Chronicles chapter 27, verse 33, it states that Ahithophel was David's top advisor. He was his number one advisor. So who is Bathsheba, and what's her relationship to David? She is the daughter of one of his top commanders. She is the granddaughter of his number one advisor, and she is the wife of another one of his top commanders. Her family is intricately connected and interwoven with David's and the history of David. This is not a random person. Uriah was not just a simple soldier. He was a close associate of David. And Bathsheba's family, her whole family, are closely associated with David. We must remember this association because it makes everything make a little bit more sense when we understand the connections here. Now, when we're going over this story, there are many people who make various claims. The two big claims that are made, first, has become very popular in the modern day, is the claim that David raped Bathsheba. Now, the reasoning for this claim is as follows. There are two things, almost always included when somebody makes this argument. The first thing is, in 2 Samuel chapter 11, verse 2, it states that David walked upon the roof of the king's house, and from the roof he saw a woman washing herself. And then in verse 4, it states that she was purified from her uncleanness. So the connection is made that the washing is what purified her from her uncleanness. This is a reference back to the 15th chapter of Leviticus, where it talks about how a woman is cleansed ritualistically, not morally, but ritualistically cleansed from the female menstruation. Now, the reason for this being brought up is that there have been some accusations that Bathsheba was purposely bathing out in public to seduce David. And they point this out that no, this was a ritualistic thing. She wasn't there to seduce anybody, which I agree she wasn't, but we'll get back to that. The next thing they bring up is verse 4 again, where it says that he took her. It says, and David sent messengers and took her, and she came in unto him, and he lay with her. So they latch onto this word took. This obviously means that this was non-consensual. This was forced. This was whether it was physical force or coercion. It was a forced interaction. It was not consensual because he took her. And this is the basic claim for it. If you're going to claim outright that he raped her, that he actually forced her, this is your argument. Now, there are a few issues with both of these claims. First of all, the ritualistic cleansing claim. In Leviticus chapter 15, makes no mention of a woman having to wash herself in order to be cleansed from the menstruation. She separates herself, and then she's clean. She separates herself for 7 days. When that's over, she's clean. No washing necessary. Nothing's necessary. She's clean. If it goes beyond the 7 days, if she has what they call an issue, meaning things are going longer than they should, then she has to wait until 7 days after the issue ends. And then she makes a sacrifice of 2 turtle doves. Again, no mention of washing. Now, if a man has an issue, he has to wash himself, but the woman doesn't. The woman only has to wash herself in regards to any of this in the case of sexual intercourse, at which case both the man and the woman have to wash themselves, and then they're only unclean until the end of the day, until the evening. So this whole claim of this being a ritualistic cleansing doesn't really fit, doesn't work. Not if you're using the scriptures. Now some people say, oh, Jews have this tradition. They may have. That doesn't mean David and Bathsheba had this tradition. So going by what's in the Bible, there was no need for her to be washing. This was not a ritualistic cleansing. Now to the bigger issue. David took her. Does this mean that he forced himself on her? No, because the word took is used in the Bible to refer to taking a wife. It is never used in reference to rape. So for instance, in Genesis chapter 38, verse 2, we read that Judah took Shua as his wife. David himself in 1 Samuel chapter 25, verse 40, he sends to Abigail to say that he wants to take her to be his wife. And in verse 43, it says that David took Ahinoam to be his wife. And there are several other instances where this is true. You take a wife. And in the past tense, I took a wife. This is very clearly set out that the word took refers to marriage. And therefore, when it says that David took her, it is saying not that he raped her, but that he engaged in marital relations with her, even though they were not married. That is why it uses that term. Now, 2 chapters later, in chapter 13, we read how Amnon forced his sister Tamar. But it doesn't say that David forced her. It says he took her. It's a very different language. And the author very specifically uses this different language to describe the two different events. One was rape, one was not. Now, the second and more common belief regarding all of this is that this was just simply adultery, and that it was planned by David. David saw her. This is the basic reasoning. Verse 2, he sees her. She's beautiful. He begins to lust after her. Verse 3, he inquires after her because he wants to satisfy his lust. In verse 4, he sends for her with the intent of satisfying his lust. There you go. He obviously only sent for her because he wanted to sleep with her, because he planned a sexual encounter, and that was the only reason he sent for her, and no other reason can be given. Now, even with this reasoning, we can still reason it out that it counts as rape. And the reasoning on this is, he was king, so she couldn't say no, and therefore could not say yes either. There was no possibility of either giving or denying consent. She couldn't give consent, she couldn't refuse consent. She just couldn't do anything. She had no choice. And in that situation, in the modern day, it's considered rape. But there are problems with this too. Even with just saying it was planned adultery, all of this still has problems in the fact that David is described consistently as being a man after the Lord's own heart. In 1 Samuel chapter 13, verse 14, when God sends Samuel to anoint David as king, he says, I am picking a man after my own heart. He specifically says that David is chosen because he is a man after God's own heart. And all through it, he is held up as an example of a righteous man and a great king, even after the events of Uriah and all this affair, all the kings that come after him. David is held up as the standard of what a great king is, what a great man is. We see this over and over. In 1 Kings chapter 9, verse 4, Solomon has said that he will be blessed if he walks before God as David thy father walked, in integrity of heart and in uprightness, to do according to all that I have commanded thee. He has said, you act like David and you will be blessed. Later on, in 1 Kings 11, verse 33, Solomon is condemned for not acting like David. It says here, because that they have forsaken me and have not walked in my ways, to do that which is right in mine eyes, and to keep my statutes and my judgments, and his heart is become as David his father, and he repenteth not as David his father, that I may forgive him. He is not acting like David. He is being condemned for not being like David. 1 Kings 14, verse 8, speaking to Jeroboam, he says, and rent the kingdom away from the house of David, and gave it thee, and yet thou hast not been as my servant David, who kept my commandments, and who followed me with all his heart, to do that only which was right in my eyes. Again, David is the standard of greatness, not just of being a great king, but of righteousness. 1 Kings chapter 15, verses 3 and 5. David's heart was perfect before God. It says here, and he walked in all the sins of his father which he had done before him, and his heart was not perfect with the Lord his God as the heart of David his father, because David did that which was right in the eyes of the Lord, and turned not aside from anything that he commanded him in all the days of his life, save only in the matter of Uriah the Hittite. And then later on in that same chapter, verse 11, talking about King Asa. And Asa did that which was right in the eyes of the Lord, as did David his father. David was a man after the Lord's own heart. He sought the Lord. You remember the Psalms of David. He is constantly seeking the Lord. He is always wanting to follow the Lord. His mind is only on the Lord. The idea that such a great man, that even after this, he's still considered the greatest king. Even God holds him up as the standard of righteousness for all kings to come after him. You are not going to convince me that a man of this caliber saw a woman and instantly turned to adultery, that his first thought upon seeing her was an adulterous affair. Nor will you convince me that he raped her in any way. He was king, but she knew he held the law of God as the greatest thing. And if he had offered a sexual encounter and she said no, she would have been confident that she could have done that because he would have upheld the law. You will not convince me that he just became evil overnight. It just doesn't make sense. The psychology doesn't work. So let me tell you what I think happened. Let us go through this step by step in chapter 11, and let us consider each point. I look at this as a snowball of small errors. So let's look at these errors. The first error we see, verse 1, he didn't go with the army, he tarried. I don't blame him for wanting to. He's been at war for over 20 years now. First running from Saul, then he becomes king, and he's at almost constant war, conquering the land, bringing the rest of the land that God promised Israel, and subduing all the neighbors. He's been at war 20 years. He wants to rest. I don't blame him. But he still should have been with his men. That's his first error. His duty was to be with his men. He was where he shouldn't have been. Error number 1. Error number 2 comes, on the other hand, from Bathsheba herself, because she was bathing in an open court. Now, I don't think she had any intention of seducing anybody. I don't think she even considered the possibility that somebody could see her, but she should have. It's not that she was being evil. She wasn't out there displaying her body to the public, but she was careless. Even if you want to take the idea that this was a ritual cleansing, which I think is total garbage. I think that's just has no foundation to it. But even if you do take that, why wasn't she bathing in the house? Why was she out in the open court? I don't think she was being evil, but she was being careless. Error number 2. Error number 3, David looked. Now, I don't think that David purposely was spying on his neighbors. He was on the top of his roof, enjoying the cool of the evening. Something caught his eye, and I don't blame him. He looked over. What was that? He sees a woman bathing. At that moment, he should have turned away and gone back into the house, but he didn't. He continued to look, at least long enough to evaluate her physical attractiveness, as well as to get enough information to inquire after her and to get accurate information from his questions. He looked, and he continued to look when he shouldn't have. Error 3. Now, when he inquired after her, I do not consider that an error, nor do I consider that anything wrong. He saw a woman. He already had 5 or 6 wives at this time, probably more. And he had every right to take more wives. He saw a beautiful woman. Yeah, he looked a little longer than he should have, but when he inquired after her, I have every belief that he inquired after her thinking, I'd like to marry her. She's a beautiful woman. Let's see if we can arrange a marriage. And there's nothing wrong with that. But then he found out she was married. Why did he still invite her over? I think at this point his intentions are still honorable. He still had good intentions. He did not intend an affair. So why does he invite her over? Well, let us go back to who Bathsheba is. She is she is the daughter of Eliam, wife of Uriah, granddaughter of Ahithophel. She most likely was a young girl when they were on the run from Saul. And if you will recall, David's army had all their families with them. It wasn't just the men. They brought their wives and children. During those 16 months that he stayed in the town of Ziklag with the Philistines, they were all there. The women and children were taken captive by the Amalekites, and David went and rescued them. Most likely, Bathsheba was among the children that were taken captive. At this time, she was probably around 10 years old. She's about 20 years younger than David. And at this time, she probably developed a kind of girlish crush on the great hero of Israel. Her father and her grandfather were close associates of David. She would later marry another close associate of David. She knew who David was, and she had, I believe, a childish crush on her. David, on the other hand, he learns who she is, and he's not thinking, oh, well, I gotta get this. No, he's saying, that's Bathsheba? I mean, that's that 10-year-old girl I used to know? And she's grown up. How much time has passed? And he doesn't send for her with the intent of having a sexual affair. but to catch up. He remembers her playing with all the other kids back in Ziklag. He remembers, she was probably a kind of a doting little girl on him at the time. And you say, hey, come over to dinner. Let's catch up. Let's talk about old times. And he invites her to eat dinner with him, most likely in his own chambers, not in a dining hall, but in his own chambers where he would eat his private dinners. That's his fourth error. He invites her to a private dinner. Now, this situation, he and Bathsheba, I think she went because she also remembers the great hero of David. She knows who he is. She remembers having a crush on him, and she enjoys that he has noticed her. I don't think she went with any intent of seducing him. I don't think she went with any intent other than to have a nice chat with him. But in this situation, she is a beautiful woman. The man that she has idolized for most of her childhood is sitting next to her. Still a handsome man. He's about 45. He's still a handsome man. Still very virile, you could say. She is a beautiful woman. They start to have some friendly banter, start flirting. One thing leads to another, and we get the first actual sin of adultery. Now, I think at this point they are still both very much feeling the guilt of this action, because the indication is that they sleep together and then they go their separate ways and they don't contact each other. There's no attempt to come back together. And I think they both understand if we come back together, we're going to continue the affair, and they don't want it. They feel guilty. But then Bathsheba discovers she is pregnant, and she has to tell David. And we get the cover-up, the attempted cover-up, where and remember, his idea isn't to kill Uriah right out. He's not an evil man. But he is desperate to hide the affair. Now, why is he desperate to hide the affair? Is it just, I got to hide my guilt? I doubt it. I don't know, from everything that David, especially in the Psalms, it doesn't make sense that David is only thinking of his own reputation. I think he honestly thinks that if this affair was revealed, it would destroy the nation. Because you would have those who would say, hey, it doesn't matter if he's the king. The law of Moses states that those who are engaged in adultery are to be stoned to death. It doesn't matter that he's the king. We need to enforce the law. Then there would be others who say, you can't kill David. He was anointed by God to be king. We don't have the right to kill him. He's the king. We can't do that. And it would divide the nation. And he's fearing civil war. And his first thought is, well, if I can pass this off as Uriah's son, we're good. And he brings Uriah back. Now that doesn't work out because Uriah is a very honorable, very noble man. And after trying twice and failing, David says, well, the only other thing we can do is if we can't pass it off as Uriah's, I have to claim it as mine, but I can't claim it as mine unless I marry Bathsheba. And the only way I can marry Bathsheba is if her husband's dead. And again, all of this is, we cannot have this revealed or it will cause civil war. That is why he sends Uriah to die, because he has to find a way to cover up the affair so that the people do not divide over it. That's his reasoning. At least that's what I believe his reasoning is. So he sends Uriah to his death, and he marries Bathsheba, so that now the son can be considered legitimate. And he thinks he has saved his nation because he has set this up and he has concealed his affair. And so what we have here is not a great man after the Lord's own heart seeing a woman and instantly deciding to have an affair. What we have is the gradual descent. David didn't leap off a precipice into the pit. He was led carefully down to hell. Gradual descent, step by step, until it was too late. This is what I think happened. The idea of rape and the idea of an instantaneous switch does not make sense. This is what I think happened. And I think Bathsheba was a full, willing participant. I do not believe she was unconsenting. I do not believe that him being the king was sufficient to remove her culpability in the whole situation. I do not think she knew that David was planning to kill Uriah. That is one thing that I think she is innocent in. Now, I think she knew after the fact. I don't think it was kept a secret from her afterwards. But she didn't know until after it was done. I think that was all on David. And Joab, who carried out the order. But let us leave that here. This is my analysis of the story of David and Bathsheba. I have no doubt that there will be many people who not only disagree, but will get angry at me for saying this, because people have gotten angry at me for saying it in the past. But this is what I honestly believe happened. And in my opinion, it is the only thing that actually makes sense when we consider everything.